Psalm 19 and verse 14 says these: "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." And that should be our prayer as we come to look at God's word this morning. As I said, with our fellowship in Pakenham, we took the decision some months ago that we would look at the parables. There are many, and they're fascinating, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. But as you get into the parables, you will probably realize that they're a little bit more complicated than initially. Oh, gorgeous. They're a little bit more. That's a lovely thing for somebody to say. Wonderful. Hello, darling. How are you? Thank you for bringing it. You just look at them and you think, wow, well, there's a little bit more to this, and you start to delve into the parables, and wow, that's a bit more complicated than I thought. And the Lord's teaching is such that it's quite amazing, particularly with this one that we're looking at this morning, this one of the parable of the weeds, or as we used to say in the olden days, the wheat and the tares, but it's the wheat and the weeds now, isn't it? However you describe it. But I think if we're looking for answers to the things that are happening in the world, we're thinking of illness. We can't help but think of illness when we think of our brother Malcolm. But we think of illness and the world, sickness and all those things that affect the body. We think about the pandemic that is still with us, but it appears to be controlled in a certain way. My sister-in-law's brother-in-law, I think he's now had his 5th injection. He's having basically one every 6 months, but he's very vulnerable. I think he had a liver transplant over 20 something years ago, he's had all kinds of things. He's what's determined as a creaking gait for many years, but he's still there, and so this is wonderful how medical science can do it, but it doesn't happen in all cases. But there's the pandemic, there's Afghanistan and Ukraine that we've mentioned in our prayers, India again, where there is such persecution, and we said, why? Why? We only have to look at verse 28, when the master replies to the question from his servants, "What's happened? You planted good seed. What's happened?" And he said, "An enemy has done this." And then when we get into the explanation, he said, "The enemy is the devil." It's that simple. When you look at it, it's that simple. We have an enemy, and he's out to get us. We don't have to look much further than our own communities to see the work of the devil as he seeks to enslave people, men, women, and children, with addictions and all kinds of other things. I've seen it. I mean, I live in an exceptionally nice town. Beautiful. They call it the jewel in the crown of Suffolk. Not sure about that, but it's certainly a nice place to live. And yet you only have to scratch the surface to see some of the appalling evidences of sin and degradation there. And I believe the devil is trying, as he started to do in the Garden of Eden, trying to obliterate that very spark of humanity that is created in mankind, the image of God. Paul was right when he identified the battle we face as a spiritual one, didn't he? In Ephesians chapter 6, beginning of verse 12, he says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world rulers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavens." It's a battle, and we know who our enemy is. And it's got to be the most applicable text we can apply to this parable. Jesus is literally saying, this is what things look like. This is what things have become. It's a battlefield out there, and there's a war going on. I mean, it's so relevant, isn't it, when we only have to see the news from Afghanistan. I don't know whether you realize, I'm not sure what the news is like in New Zealand, but we have quite a sanitized view of the news here. You may not realize it, but I've been in other parts of the country. We were in Albania. We go out there quite often. or we have been. We support work out there, but their news is much more graphic, and they show things on their news channel that the BBC and ITV over here would not show. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I'm just saying it's quite sanitized. So if you look at the news and you think, oh, that's terrible, it's probably 10 times worse at least. That's the reality of it. This is what things have become in the battle. This story is, as is often the case with parables, quite simple. Excuse me. Yet, as we delve into it, you'll see that there are many complexities. Jesus unravels them. It's a simple story of rural life. Life in Jesus' time was dominated by an agricultural economy. I mean, we've seen before in many of the parables that the children of Israel either lived in villages or small towns, or were supported by local family-run farms. But the narrative changes a little bit as the story progresses. It begins with a man sowing a field. He sows it with good seed. And this is similar to the parable of the sower. And we take it that maybe he's a subsistence farmer, making a living as best he can in difficult circumstances. That was the parable of the sower, wasn't it? And Jesus' hearers would be able to identify with this. Every farmer wants to sow the best seed he can, so has the best chance of a good crop come harvest. So he's not going to put rubbish into the ground. He wants the best seed he possibly can. And the science of agronomy today is based on the principle of getting the best yield from the best land. So you want to make sure you have the best land. My nephew, he works on a monoculture farm. They grow lettuces. That's all they grow. Somewhere down near, I think is it Deal, that sort of area of land. It's not a huge lettuce farm. There are some who are much bigger, but all they grow is lettuces. And he was telling me that when he's out there spraying, it's all computer controlled, so that when they have harvested some of the lettuces, if a particular square meter, it's that accurate square meter of land, is not giving the same kind of return that the other bits is, they give it a little bit more fertilizer. It's that accurate and it's that sophisticated to get the best yield out. And this is no difference, is what the farmers of Jesus' day would want to do. So he sows the best seed he could afford. And then there comes an enemy under the cover of darkness while men were sleeping. And among the good seed, he sows weeds. And it would seem, although rare, sabotage of a crop was not unknown in Jesus' time. The listeners would have been shocked, but not surprised. We're not told of the reason for the enemy's action. We're not told why he would want to do this. It could be that he wanted to give him a competitive advantage over his neighbor, or maybe he had a grudge. We don't know. But whatever the reason he had, whatever perverted reason he had for sowing weeds amongst the seeds, he did it. He did it under the cover of darkness. In the 1970s and 80s, I worked for a number of years at Jay's Limited in Thetford, which is well known for producing Jay's Fluid, which is you may know it, is a black disinfectant, a very good one, very strong disinfectant. It was a large national company employing on the Thetford site around about 1,000 people, vast site. It's not as big as some places, obviously, but it was big for Thetford, I promise you, one of the biggest employers in Thetford. They had subsidiary companies throughout Britain and in Ireland. And we dealt in household chemicals. We did disinfectant and bleach that were marketed through three main divisions. The company was set up. There was the industrial division, which meant that they sold the products for industrial cleaning, for offices, factories, and all this kind of stuff. This was the industrial division. And then there was the retail division that sold to retail outlets, like little shops, if you remember, Arkwrights are open all hours. That was the style of customers that we wanted for the retail division, and people would go around these shops and sell them toilet rolls and disinfectants and bleaches and all kinds of other things that we sold. And then there was a promotional division that sold to the supermarket chains, the likes of Mr. Tesco and Mr. Sainsbury's and Aldi. Well, no, Aldi was about them, but anyway, all these other ones. Co-op was one of the big ones. We had a rival who, unlike Jay's, didn't have their own brand, but they manufactured or they produced product for anyone who wanted to have a product under their own label. So they were own label manufacturers. They produced basically the same. Maybe they tweaked the recipe a little, but generally it was the same product, just with a different label on. And our chairman was quoting in competition with this company for a supermarkets business. And he came to know, and I don't know how he knew, but this subcontractor had let it be known that he would undercut whatever price Jay's quoted him. He would come in under it because he wanted the business so much. And so our chairman went in with a ridiculously low price, well below the cost of manufacture, because he gambled that the subcontractor would have to honour his word and undercut our quoted price, even if we'd got the business, because we were big enough and had loads of other customers, we could have managed. And so anyway, the subcontractor put in a lower bid, and he did indeed get the contract. But some months later, because the business was not viable, he was losing money with every bottle he produced, the subcontractor went bankrupt. And our chairman promptly bought the company out for a pittance. And he then requoted for the supply of the product to the supermarket at a higher price. So he'd succeeded in removing a competitor and acquired some business assets very cheaply. He'd done nothing illegal. But morally, that's repugnant, isn't it? Terrible. Leaves a nasty taste. Such is the world of business. It doesn't have to be, but that's how people react. What are the motives for such action? I would suggest there are many. Greed has to be one of them. Building greater barns, we could say. The kudos of being at the head of a big company and the power and status that's carried with it. I mean, he had it's a bit like John Prescott, chairman had two Jags. Well, one was a Daimler, the other one was a Jaguar, but he had two very big cars. In fact, the chauffeur came one morning and just said, he came to pick the guy up and he said, "I'm terribly sorry, but I have a puncture. It will take me about half an hour. Leave it, let's take the other car instead." You know, that's what you do if you're chairman of a company, isn't it? You want to be top dog in a dog-eat-dog world. We only had a few months ago, was it a few months, that P&O sacked all their workers and then took on staff, obviously at a much lower rate. So this was the world that we see. This is what has happened. An enemy has done this, weed amongst the seed. This is where the story alters, but because it says, it appears that our farmer is not the individual we met in the parable of the sower, but a man of some wealth and standing, because he's got bondservants or slaves, whatever you like to call them, working for him. And they report the attack on the field. They see as it starts to come up and they say, "Whoa, this is not just this good seed you sowed, or we sowed on your behalf. There are weeds growing there. How has this happened, master? You gave us good seed. We sowed it, or you sowed it yourself." We see the respect that the servants have to their employer. And the response is that the infestation of the weeds is no accident, but a deliberate ploy to destroy the crop, certainly to reduce its worth, so that it would have an effect on the profitability of the farm. And there are various interpretations of what the weeds are. The consensus seems that it was darnel, which comes from the Latin word for drunk. It's described as the wheat's evil twin because it resembles wheat so closely. Looks the same. Darnel is poisonous, and in small quantities it has an intoxicating effect. There was a Roman law against anyone sowing darnel in other people's fields. And this may have been known to Jesus' hearers and added to their outrage. This is terrible. It's not just a nasty thing to do. It's an illegal thing to do. It's against the law. So a substance akin to today's cannabis is sown in the man's field. And then the next part of the story is so typical of so many of us when we see a problem. What shall we do, Master? What shall we do? And then dig up the very evident weeds and gather them for disposal. This was their first thought. Shall we dig it all up? We'll dig up the weeds. And I think we're all a bit like that, aren't we? We see we're okay with prayer and trusting, we say. We're trusting God, but ultimately we want action. And we want to be doing something, anything, rather than sit by and do nothing. I don't know, maybe I'm speaking just for myself, I don't know. I know in my heart, however much I acknowledge the wonderful, outrageous grace that I see each day, there is always a part of me that keeps saying, I must do my bit. And it's not the works are wrong. Of course not. We have to do what God leads us to do. It's just that their works are a sign of what Jesus has done in my life, not that I can do anything to win his favor. There's no way we can win favor with God. It is all of grace, all of grace. And it's also a warning, I think, to us all regarding being judgmental. The parable clearly tells us that we can't tell who is wheat and who is weed. Only God has the wisdom and the knowledge and the right to decide that. The master, it's evident from this parable, has great wisdom as well as patience. I mean, as an example of God, as a picture of God, it's wonderful. He knows that in uprooting the weeds, some of the crop will be damaged. I don't know if you've ever tried pulling weeds. If you're a gardener, you try to, I used to do, you just go around with the hoe and oh, blimey, I didn't mean to do that because I've snagged the plant and I've damaged the plant perhaps, and you just have to be very tender then with it. Some of the crop's going to be damaged and destroyed. No, he says, we'll leave it. We'll leave it till harvest. Then we can resolve the issue without damaging the crop. The weeds will be gathered first, bound up and burnt, and the wheat will be gathered and we stored in the barn. Jesus explains this. He puts names to the parts of the parable in his explanation. The sower of the good seed is Jesus, Son of Man, is the sower. He is the word, and he sows the good seed. The field is the world. It's everywhere. It's all around us. The enemy, as we've said, is the devil. And the harvest is the time when time will cease and God will renew all things. The final judgment is going to come. The harvesters, Jesus tells us, will be the angels. We read earlier, didn't we, part of the story of Joseph and how in his rise to power and influence, he had, under God, been able to show Pharaoh that his dreams were a prophecy of an impending event that would have had disastrous consequences, not just for Egypt, but also for the surrounding countries, Jacob and his family, because Egypt was a bit of a breadbasket, and they relied, a lot of the surrounding nations relied on the fertility of the Nile Delta there, for the bounty that it provided, and a famine in Egypt would have had disastrous consequences for all the surrounding nations as well. If we see this world as a battlefield between good and evil, I wonder whether this story of Joseph was an attempt by the evil one to wipe out God's godly line through starvation. Jacob sent his son to Egypt to buy grain, didn't he? Genesis 42 tells us that. Go to Egypt. They've got grain there. And it was under the provision of God. There's always in the Old Testament, there's always this underlying, never perhaps always visible, but certainly an undertone of the battle that's going on. And the devil is trying to wipe out his holy line. We saw that, and we see that as we get a little bit further on in Exodus, when he decides, that when Pharaoh decides he's going to get rid of all the boy children, they're going to go. If you get rid of all the boys, the girls are going to be able to marry. Who they're going to marry? Egyptians. And they're not going to be Israelites or God's people anymore. They're going to be Egyptians, and they would be wiped out. What we have to understand is that Pharaoh's dream came true. And by listening to the voice of God through Joseph, Egypt and the house of Jacob were saved. And Jesus' parable is just as prophetic as Pharaoh's dreams and the interpretation that Joseph put on them. He's saying, this is what's going on now. This is what's going to happen tomorrow and the next day, until God sends the harvester in, until God decides that his harvest is ready. There's going to be a time coming when the weeds and the wheat will be gathered and will be separated. So Jesus clearly tells us that there is a battle going on day by day. I see it in some of the lives of some of the people I mix with day by day during the week. It's a timely reminder of what is occurring in heavenly places, a battle by cosmic forces, as we see in Ephesians 6. We only see the flesh and blood outworkings of the influences behind the actions, but they're there. Just as Pharaoh's dream was a prophetic warning, this parable has to be taken as a warning to each of us, what is happening each and every day. And it's a reminder as well that we need to be ready for battle. When Paul talks about armor, he doesn't mean say it's a nice thing that you just keep in the corner there, and you can just look at it and say, oh yes, that armor is really nice. He said, put it on. Put it on every day. You need it. You need the breastplate. You need the helmet. You need this, above all, you need the sword. You need the shield. I have this thing about the shield. Some people disagree with me, but I don't know about you, but if you read anything about certainly the wars in the Middle Ages, when the knights were there and the men at arms, and they wore this kind of armor, a shield was not, going back even to the Saxon times, a shield was not just a defensive weapon. A shield, and the Roman times, the shield, which is where Paul got his illustration from, a shield was an offensive weapon. And we should use our faith offensively. I'm not saying we should offend people with our faith, obviously, but we can use it offensively. The Roman soldiers would link shields, and they would stand and they would push. And they would push against the enemy, and we can use that linked together. Sorry, it's going off a great tangent, but if you ever heard of what's called the Testudo that the Roman soldiers did, it was the tortoise, in that all the soldiers used to link shields around the front, a cohort of about 100 and something men. They would all link shields so the whole sides were covered. Then the ones in the middle would put their shields above them. And it's said that they were so strong that you could have actually, they didn't have them in those days, but you could put a standard tank on top of them because they were so strong. And they could survive huge onslaughts from the forces that came against them just by linking together their shields. That's why your faith is so important. Your faith isn't just important to you, your faith is important to him as well. My faith isn't for me, it's for you. Your faith is for me. We need to link our shields together. The only way that the opposing forces against the Roman army were able to break the Testudo, the tortoise, was that they used to play dead. And then the Testudo would walk over them. And then, of course, the people they thought were dead weren't dead. They would come up and they would gut them from the inside out. And don't we find that often? That it's not outside forces, but something from within the fellowship that destroys it. Very rarely we're persecuted. Obviously, sometimes it is, which is a sad. Sorry, we're digressing. We need to be ready for battle. We need to have our armor on. We need to keep it polished. We need to keep it flexible. We need to make sure that it works well. We need to keep our sword sharp and rust free. We see on the television news all the stuff coming in from Ukraine. We see that they're equipped and ready to do battle. They're fighting wherever they need to be. And if you remember your Second World War history, Winston Churchill made his famous call to arms as England faced the real possibility of an invasion, which was the first one since 1066. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we will never surrender. We have to say that today. We're going to fight you. We're going to fight you in our fellowships. We're going to fight you in our communities. We're going to fight you in our neighbourhoods. We're going to fight you in our homes. I'm going to fight you in my own life, because you are not going to have sovereignty over me. My soul belongs to and is protected by God. Paul, in that passage in Ephesians, tells the disciples to do that. Put on the whole armour of God and to stand firm. But shouldn't the prospect of the final harvest and the terrible consequences for those outside of the kingdom stir us to redouble our efforts to ensure that as many people as possible hear about what Jesus has done? I think it's a vital part of our faith and discipleship to share with all we meet the saving knowledge of Jesus, the crucified Saviour. I mean, Paul says, to the Greeks, it was a stumbling block. The cross, a stumbling block. They couldn't understand it. And you see it, don't you? You see that, you've got to meet power with power. No, we don't. The might of the Roman Empire couldn't stand against a tiny baby born in an obscure part of the Roman Empire. And what was seen by the rest of the world as a defeat at the cross was in fact the greatest triumph the world has ever seen. James tells us that we don't always have to use words. Sometimes actions speak louder. It's the way we live that people notice. But I'm going to finish with two quotes. One's from Spurgeon. It has to be a Spurgeon quote here this morning. We're not responsible to God for the souls that are saved, but we are responsible for the gospel that is preached and the way we preach it. At our Bible study on Wednesday, one of the brothers was saying, there's so many people, how are they going to hear if they won't come to church? Well, if they won't come to church, then we have to make sure we take the gospel out into the community. I don't mean we stand up in the marketplace and preach. If that's your gift, then yes, that's wonderful. Do it. But if not, just live your life as is guided by the gospel. The other one is from C.T. Studd. He was a great cricketer, but he was also a missionary. And he said this: some want to live with the sound of church or chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of hell. So if you want to help some people, you have to go almost to hell itself to help them. I've seen some people like that. They need our help. And by God's grace, he will give us the strength and the words and the actions to help them. Amen.